Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning if you're on the West Coast, this afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and hopefully not the evening if you're anywhere else. But we are thrilled to have you. My name is Leah Walker. I'm a senior research associate at the Institute for Security and Technology, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Vipin Narang, who is the Frank Stanton Professor of Nuclear Security at MIT. Vipin has just published this fantastic book. I highly recommend it to everyone, called Seeking the Bomb. And he puts forth in this book a strategy of proliferation. So we're going to be talking to him today about hedges, technology, and the future of proliferation. Thank you so much for joining us, Vipin.
Thanks, Leah. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for doing this to you and Andy. And fire away.
Fantastic.
Let's get cooking.
Well, so I have a lot of questions about this book because you really put forward this very comprehensive strategy, but I wanted to ask a few questions at the onset about what inspired you to write this book. So obviously, I think you identified a gap in nuclear proliferation studies. So I'm curious as to what inspired you to write this book, what got you thinking about this book, and how you're thinking about the way this book contributes to the field going forward.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It actually, it's interesting because I got into this business really as an undergrad, or I got interested in this field as an undergrad. I was a chemical engineer, and in the middle of my undergraduate engineering studies, India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons. And they were the first states to test nuclear weapons since China in 1964. I mean, India had a PNE in between. Israel's alleged program never tested. South Africa never tested. So here you had sort of new entrants into the nuclear club. And that's sort of how I got interested very early on in sort of nuclear security. And it was really their entrance into the nuclear club that sort of started my shift into the study of nuclear weapons. And then it was really, that's a proliferation question. And I ended up diverting in sort of my doctoral studies and in my first book into the study of nuclear strategy. By then, India and Pakistan had sort of had the problem of sort of operationalizing their nuclear weapons. And so the first book was really about what happens after you get nuclear weapons. How do you think about deterring conflict? And I sort of left aside the proliferation question. So I finished the first book and I'm sort of thinking, what I really got into this business because of the spread of nuclear weapons. So, why is it, that some states proliferate in some ways and not others? India, the big question with India and the sort of how did it get there question was it spent 15, 16 years with its nuclear weapons program in the icebox after the 1974 PNE. So why did it do that? Why did it stall out or put itself in neutral? And then why did it make the decision to weaponize in the late 1980s? And, the proliferation literature had sort of gone down this rabbit hole of sort of why do states want nuclear weapons? And that spawned, almost 2 decades worth of proliferation research, all of it, fabulous. But it was sort of becoming a point of diminishing returns, in my view. The motivations debate is probably not going to be settled conclusively for most scholars or analysts. And I sort of turned to this question of, well, okay, let's leave aside why states want nuclear weapons and stipulate once they get them, how do they think about going about, sort of the process. And that's where sort of strategies of proliferation came from. And it's sort of a nice complement to the first book. The first book was strategies of deterrence. This is strategies of proliferation. I will never write another book probably, but there's strategies of coercion or compellence at the end of, the trilogy. And so that was really what spawned the idea for the book. And it's also this observation that, states proliferate in different ways. And it's not just this sort of stylized view that we have in the popular conception that all states have a Manhattan Project, right? And they all sort of sprint as quickly as they can for nuclear weapons. Most states can't even decide whether they want nuclear weapons in the first place. And they develop what we call hedges. And it brings hedging sort of back into the mainstream proliferation pathways. It's not just sort of a separate concept, but, hedgers either they can stay there for a long time, they can stay there indefinitely, but they either, for the most part, most hedgers at some point decide they're going to forswear nuclear weapons, or they culminate in the development of nuclear weapons and go all the way. And sort of thinking about why states go up and down that process is sort of one of I think one of the aims of the book, and sort of bringing hedging centrally in as a waypoint along the proliferation process. And there are different types of hedgers. So disaggregate sort of allies that are hedgers, adversaries that are hedgers, and sort of this concept of nuclear latency sort of sitting like pretty early on in a state's program. And then the question is, why do states sort of decide to go from, I'm not sure I want the bomb, to I want the bomb? And that's where sort of the domestic politics and domestic political consensus for such a major I mean, you're a state that's basically, having to commit to a massive industrial scientific undertaking with huge military and security implications. And you can't really do that unless you get all the sort of, veto players sort of on board. And that's not an easy process. And some of the most, I think, concerning proliferators during the Cold War, like Sweden, right? We forget Sweden was essentially a nuclear weapon state, and actually probably went a lot farther than most people think. But it decided to give up nuclear weapons because domestically, they just, the Swedish parliament and leadership essentially decided that nuclear weapons were not an answer to their security problem. And Sweden ends up becoming a champion of disarmament, early in the NPT era. So, they're thinking about how critical the role of domestic political consensus is. And it sort of gives you a lens into how you can slow states down, or you can stop a state that might be thinking about nuclear weapons. This is sort of the JCPOA theory of empowering, the relative moderates in Iran to focus on growth and development and forswear nuclear weapons, to give them an opportunity, an option, of a world where they can have sort of and enjoy the benefits of, economic openness and trade without having to rely on nuclear weapons. And that helped fracture sort of Iranian domestic political consensus. And so, that's sort of a lens into the regulator for when a state may decide to go, all the way towards developing nuclear weapons. And once a state decides to do that, another aim of the book was, trying to point out they're not everyone looks like the US or Soviet Union with these Manhattan Project, open, rapid marches towards nuclear weapons. It's a long process in a lot of cases. And, states, once they decide they want nuclear weapons themselves, sort of have to confront a growing and powerful non-proliferation, counter-proliferation regime that can stop them. The very threats that motivate these states to start pursuing nuclear weapons are the very threats that can kill the program or the state itself. And so how do you do that in, a world in which, if you are caught pursuing nuclear weapons illegally in contravention of your sort of obligations to the NPT, you might get killed. And so there's sort of the options, if you can't sprint, are really finding somebody who will protect you, a major power. Right? I call that sheltered pursuit. North Korea availed itself of it. Pakistan availed itself of it from the United States, where the Reagan administration essentially turned a blind eye to Pakistani nuclear pursuit in pursuit of higher geopolitical goals, the war in Afghanistan, for example. And so if you can find a major power who can shelter you and protect you, then that really increases your chance of success, because you can sort of get to the finish line, hopefully before the major power shelter evaporates, but certainly before adversaries can do anything about it. But those are few and far between. And I don't think that strategy is going away. I think there are candidates for future sheltered pursuit, Saudi Arabia, maybe Turkey, maybe Australia. And so there are some states who may be able to cultivate sort of shelter if they ever decided they wanted to develop nuclear weapons. But in reality, most states, including allies who want to pursue nuclear weapons, where the superpower ally, in this case, the United States, would be the one allergic to, let's say, Japanese or South Korean nuclear weapons, and has been historically, have to think about covert strategy. So hiding is really, for my money, the most prominent strategy going forward. I think we're going to see a rise in hedgers, which, as you noted, states that sort of put the pieces in place because they don't know what the future will hold. They may not go all the way. We may not know when they start going down the road towards actual weaponization, because sort of figuring out when a state has made that decision is not necessarily straightforward. But the most prominent, I think, proliferator going forward will likely be hiders. And that poses real challenges. Right? Emerging technologies do make it easier to hide, but they also make it easier to detect. And so, how this washes out, I think, remains to be seen. And it's just sort of, old wine in a new bottle, right? It's the same sort of political problem of states that oppose another state's, acquisition of nuclear weapons are trying to stop them and detect them, and the other states trying to hide. And new technologies may make it easier for both sides or harder for both sides. And I don't know how it washes out. But hiders are important and disruptive because they tend to be either caught and killed or coerced with great human suffering, or they, in the rare instance they get out of the barn, you have a new nuclear entrant into the system. And so hiders are dangerous. And so, that's going to be sort of the proliferation landscape we confront in the future. We're going to have a lot more hedgers, and we're going to have, states that decide they may want nuclear weapons. Most of them are going to be hiders because they're sort of the states in the system that the major powers least want to have nuclear weapons. And so it's kind of an overview of the book. I go through quite a few cases, about 21 cases in the book of different varieties, and hopefully don't put you to sleep. So.
No, I think and I want to revisit the case studies because I think a lot of them were very insightful and even sort of rewriting what we had previously understood about how past states had proliferated. I will just quickly say some housekeeping notes. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function. But yes, so your case studies I found very interesting, particularly the India one that you referenced earlier, because you argue that the delay in actually achieving the bomb was far more intentional than previously thought. And I'm curious if you could give a bit of that argument for our audience who may not have read the book, but also walk us through how you came to this realization that no, it's actually a much more intentional waiting period than it was accusations of poor organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that India's sort of scientific establishment and organization were sort of siloed out, small, had to work on limited budgets, but that wasn't an accident, is sort of the argument. After Indira Gandhi authorizes the peaceful nuclear explosion, she authorizes it around 1972. It's conducted in 1974 for a variety of reasons. And this was, that's basically a decade after China's nuclear test. So India takes 10 years to get there. The PNE is not a nuclear weapon. It's sort of a nuclear device. It's not particularly stable. It's very big. It's a proof of concept, let's say, right? Like a technology demonstrator, as India likes to call it. But then what does India do? India basically puts Indira Gandhi, who's prime minister, puts the program in the icebox. She doesn't want to be she doesn't want to talk about nuclear weapons. There's, maybe there's some belief that the PNE bought India some existential deterrence, but there was no thought about actually overtly weaponizing the capability. And then there are a series of domestic political challenges. She institutes the emergency, she loses power, she comes back. There is, early in the 1980s, some evidence that India starts thinking about delivery systems finally. Evidence about Pakistan's advancing nuclearization starts emerging in the late 1970s, but really in the early 1980s, and especially once India sort of sniffs out the fact that the Reagan administration is going to turn a blind eye to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. And so India sort of, Indian leaders at that point keep the nuclear weapons program sort of still in neutral, but they start thinking about, well, we might need to do this. And so they start developing missiles. The basis of the Agni family was, started very early in the 1980s. But no decision is made. And a lot of that is just a lack of domestic political consensus. And Indira Gandhi is assassinated. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, takes over. He doesn't know a lot about sort of, he's sort of, new to the scene, doesn't have a lot of experience. So the idea that he's going to take India across the nuclear Rubicon when he first comes to office, he's still learning the ropes of being, a prime minister. He was a pilot in Indian Airlines before he became prime minister. And so he was finding his feet, all the while evidence that Pakistan was marching along steadily was trickling in. And Pakistan got to the finish line first in terms of having a weapon. And during the brass tacks crisis, Pakistan basically announces it has nuclear weapons and may have assembled some or fabricated some cores. The US then has to certify continually that Pakistan is not nuclear. That becomes harder. And then Rajiv Gandhi is sitting there deciding, very, very deliberately, is the answer to India's security problem trying to push for a non-nuclear South Asia under the guise of what he called the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, basically some effort at disarmament, or is it for India to get nuclear weapons? And something happens, it's probably at the end of the brass tacks crisis, where there's some evidence that Pakistan has assembled nuclear weapons or has fabricated cores or something that makes Rajiv Gandhi, basically 6 months after his Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan falls on deaf ears at the UN, sort of ridiculed for it, right? He's trying to propose sort of a nuclear-free zone and just universal disarmament. No one's having this at the UN in 1988. So at this point, Rajiv Gandhi basically says, there's nothing I can do. If Pakistan has a bomb, I have to get it to be able to deter them. China already has it. And the notion of universal disarmament is a non-starter. And so in March 1989 or thereabouts, Rajiv Gandhi just orders essentially then a sprint for India to develop nuclear weapons. And it takes them about 4 to 5 years to do so. And because of the poor organization, it took a little longer for the military to sort of get involved with the program. But it was a very conscious decision to weaponize at a very particular moment for, strategic reasons. And once that decision was made, then India is not that far off the line in terms of how long it takes them to develop nuclear weapons. And so it looks a lot more sort of strategic and a lot less dysfunctional than I think our standard story of India looks like.
Yeah, no, I think that was one of the more interesting elements of the book, was these sort of re-understandings of the internal dynamics. And I'm so glad that you included domestic political disagreements and agreements as such an integral part of your theory, because it has played out in so many ways as critical to nuclear proliferation. I also think when you talk about that tension between wanting to push for more disarmament while still hedging about maintaining the ability to go nuclear, that's a tension that we've seen in others of your case studies. This not sure whether we go full for the disarmaments initiatives around the world, or do we still want to make sure we have that safety feature in our back pocket? Do you think that that's reflective of the failures of the non-proliferation and the disarmament movements of the time? Do you think that there would ever be a way for those movements to have been significantly appealing enough for lots of these states to resist proliferation?
I think there was a moment. I mean, I think this is a Swedish story, right? So Sweden prior to the NPT, very close. In fact, it's farther than India at that point. And, the Swedish military nuclear weapons program was very far advanced. But then Sweden, the domestic political debate surfaces. And this is right before, this is why the NPT is being negotiated. The NPT is sort of on the horizon. And Sweden took that opportunity, Swedish leaders, to put all their eggs in that moment in sort of the non-proliferation basket. And I think there was this moment, the Swiss and the Swedish sort of do it at the same time. The Swiss, though, fall apart because of domestic political scandals involving military corruption and sales. But the Swedish, I think, really were at exactly like you said, we either go all the way this way or all the way this way. If we go all the way this way, what are the implications? Are we a target for the Soviet Union? We're sort of outside of NATO. So what do we, how will this work? What kind of nuclear strategy would it require? Would it make sense? And so we're sort of, at this point, where the NPT looked viable enough that Swedish leaders could, reasonably say that they could go put their eggs in that basket. I think as the NPT sort of lost its sheen, right? And the NPT operated pretty well as a collusive mechanism between the Soviet Union and the US for several decades. And I think in a lot of ways, personally, I think the fact that the NPT is still alive is a miracle. I don't think anybody expected it to last this long. And it's certainly under threat, but it's still there. And there are norms surrounding it, and a whole slew of sort of supply side restrictions, export controls, the IAEA, there's organizations that support it. But, by 1989, right? When Rajiv Gandhi has to basically make the same sort of decision that the Swedes are confronted with 3 decades or 2 decades earlier. Once it's ridiculed at the UN, Rajiv Gandhi says, like, there's no way I can do that. I can't go all the way this way. No one is going to go with me. So the only option is to go that way. And we can't sort of forestall this decision forever. And India was also confronting there was a sort of the concern that the CTBT would go into force and they wouldn't be able to test. And so that sort of accelerated their decision making. And there were sort of, I think Indian leaders decided it's either now or never, because if the CTBT goes into force, then there's a whole other legal dimension. And so that sort of posed more problems in the early 1990s that are sort of unique to India that may not exist for other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see, and none come to mind for me, so there might not just be any, but do you think any current hedgers or potential hedgers looking out for the next 10, 20 years, are any of them feeling that same tension on both ends, or are we just past that because of the state?
I agree with you. It's hard to think. I think, if you're hedging right now and you're worried about if you think nuclear weapons may be an answer to your security solution, none of those states are thinking that disarmament is a possibility, right? Like, I think that ship has sailed. And, the NPT faces a problem because, I think any organization can withstand sort of a North Korea. So North Korea is sort of funky enough and off the line enough that you say, okay, well, North Korea was a member of the NPT, withdrew, cheated, and got nuclear weapons. That's just North Korea. But if another country, which is, and by definition, any future nuclear weapons powers are going to be at one point members of the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states in good standing. And if they cheated on the NPT to sort of facilitate the development of nuclear weapons, then I think the NPT has a real problem. There is a sort of question, how many North Koreas can you sustain before the whole edifice starts crumbling down? And I'm not sure the answer to that question, but I think if Iran does, or Turkey or Saudi Arabia, or an ally like Japan or South Korea or Taiwan or something, then we might be in a different world where the NPT is no longer believed to be an effective sort of vehicle for nonproliferation.
Absolutely. And we'll turn to those future proliferators in a little bit. I do want to pull out a line from your book. You say that your framework suggests that the strategic choice to maintain a small signature in the nuclear weapons program to avoid external coercion forces a state into technically inefficient pathways, which prolongs the proliferation process and increases the likelihood of its detection. Do you think that within technology advancements of the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see a different calculus as proliferation potentially becomes more efficient and easier to hide, thus changing the likelihood of success from a very strict hiding approach?
Yeah, I worry about that. I mean, I think it can cut both ways. I mean, I think the technologies that enable more efficient hiding may also help facilitate more efficient and effective detection also. And so, national technical means are getting so much more sophisticated. Imagine being an intelligence agency and the IC in the 1980s, where you're piecing together procurement documents and false manifests. Now everything is digital, and you can sort of do big data analysis, and you can, you can pick up sort of shady procurement patterns in ways that we may not have been able to do before. So it sort of cuts both ways, but I leave open the possibility, but I'm not sure if I'm yet willing to bet whether emerging technologies favor sort of the hunter or the prey, right? So it could benefit sort of the United States. It could benefit potential proliferators, or it may cut in different ways, right? So, but I do worry that sort of as technology that is really 75 years old at this point sort of becomes more sophisticated, and you have, and you can make things sort of more compact, and maybe you don't have to develop, the plutonium pathway is risky, right? Syria tried it very brazenly, tried to literally hide an above ground reactor in plain sight. And, so states learn from that. Next time, maybe you say, okay, I won't listen to North Koreans and I'll try the enrichment pathway. And enrichers are sort of getting more sophisticated too at hiding and hardening. And, but in a lot of these cases, what's striking is when we caught hiders, you could say a lot of them are caught by luck or by happenstance, but you sort of create your own luck just by forcing and shunting the state into hiding. you're opening up the space and the time for them to slip up or to be detected. And, good luck tends to happen to those who sort of, who prepare the battlefield. And I think it's shunting a potential proliferator into hiding, isn't always a bad thing. It sort of like, it's an inefficient process. It really opens up space for somebody to leak, to slip up, to be detected. And so you buy time for good luck, right? And that's sort of, it's not a bad strategy just to buy time.
Absolutely. And then you can always buy time for a future regime change or some political disagreement that ties into your aspect of the strategy about political agreements. I am curious, you mentioned data analytics for imports. What are when you say you worry about this, what are the technologies you're concerned about on the proliferation side of things as emerging technologies, and what are the ones you are optimistic about for maintaining non-proliferation regimes?
I mean, you know more about this than I do. I'll turn the question back on you. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that there will be a novel enrichment process. I mean, laser enrichment. There are potentially disruptive technologies down the pipeline, but whether they're sort of scalable and whether a state, that an adversarial state can master and import and develop those technologies and sustain an enrichment program that way, I don't know how likely it is. I don't know. I think the biggest sort of change in non and counter proliferation, to my mind, is actually the rise of big data analytics. I mean, being able to find needles in haystacks in ways that we haven't previously been able to do is actually huge innovation. It's not technological so much as, I mean, it is, but it's not the technology we sort of think of as being at the forefront, right? It's just computing power. And it's sucking up and analyzing big amounts of data, huge amounts of data, to find needles in a haystack. Because that's essentially what you're trying to do with these proliferators. But yeah, I want to turn the question to you. What do you think are the big, I mean, what technologies concern you on the proliferator side, right? So like if an adversarial, so let's say Iran were able to get this technology, you would be more scared than you are today.
Yeah, I think I'm actually in agreement with you that there are more of these technology innovations on the searching side than the hiding side. And we can talk about, zero yield and some modeling for testing later, but that's more once you're actually further along the proliferation process. I think there are ways you can use newer technologies so you have to test less. I think there's some interesting research coming out about additive manufacturing. But for my research, I'm much more interested and concerned about emerging technologies on the non-proliferation side. So big data, of course. I also think the use of emerging technologies to limit proliferation. So we've seen very concerning trends in the past decade or so of using cyber attacks and cyber exploits to reduce likelihood of proliferation. Not very successful in North Korea, debatably successful in Iran. And my concern is that as you get these more less attributable, more murky technologies that allow you to interfere with proliferating states, that is appealing to other states, and I worry about what that means for escalation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting. We don't think a lot about sort of emerging technologies facilitating sabotage efforts. Mm-hmm. And the cyber is a good example there, but also polluting supply chains and, being able to, surreptitiously insert yourself into the supply chain. It's both statecraft, art, intelligence artcraft, but also, new technologies that let you to do that remotely. And that's why I hesitate to come down one side or the other on the ledger. I mean, I do think sort of the advantage does go, if we think that the net effect of a lot of emerging technologies is to like foster transparency, then if that's sort of the net effect, and if your goal is to hide and be covert, then at some point all the technology that make things, the oceans and the sky, everything more transparent, has got to benefit the hunter. But I just don't know, that I never underestimate the creativity of a determined, smart proliferator. Absolutely. Right. And that's one thing that comes out of doing, these cases, is no matter how backward you think this state is, N state, X state, Y state, if they're determined, they're always creative and smart, and a lot have found ways to get pretty far.
So continue on that idea of determination, what state do you think has been the most impressive based on low expectations? Like
no question, North Korea. North Korea, no one gave North Korea a chance. The academic literature didn't give North Korea a chance. And, this is a force to be reckoned with. And, for a closed economy, with or without foreign assistance, nobody, that question can be litigated, publicly for indefinitely. But the fact that North Korea essentially defied the odds. I mean, what did President Nixon called it? A fourth-rate pipsqueak power. It's a closed economy. It benefited from shelter from China, but it's unclear how much assistance came from China, as opposed to the former Soviet Union or Soviet Union, Pakistan. I'm sure China facilitated, particularly the Pakistan transfers, because there's no, as it's just remarkable to me, this is in the question, whose military airspace has to be sort of overflown to get from Islamabad to Pyongyang. But there's sort of it's impressive. I mean, I'd say the same is true of, Pakistan and India, given that they're largely developing poor economies when they were pursuing nuclear weapons. It goes to show that, technology isn't the rate limiting step, and determined proliferators, it's very hard to stop determined proliferators.
Absolutely. And I think the idea of technology not being limited, again, this is not novel technology. This is very much 1940s, 1950s technology. And I think you very clearly make the points in your book that what's far more limiting is security situations and domestic politics.
Yeah.
And on that note of security situations, we had spoken at the beginning that we're expecting more hedgers, we're expecting more hiders. Do you think that in an increasing multipolar world where so-called spheres of influence are changing as new actions are taken, obviously we have been watching what's going on in Europe, do you think that incentivizes or encourages more proliferation because you have states who are less confident in the support of their superpower ally, giving them umbrellas?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of dynamics at play, and they're all bad. So one, I think allies after the Trump administration can reasonably be concerned that a domestic political configuration in the US may emerge, if not Trump again, Trumpism, that sort of calls into question American commitment to extended deterrence. So today you have allies, formal allies of the United States, who may be quietly putting in place the groundwork for a future weapons capability. I mean, Japan is sitting on 10 tons of reactor-grade plutonium.
Yeah.
Right. So, and South Korea has been caught with his hand in the cookie jar a couple of times. Mm-hmm. So is Taiwan. Taiwan was caught with cutting a hole out of a reactor fuel. I mean, the lengths to which some of our allies have gone to hide their activities from us is remarkable. And so you have the sort of the return of the allies. You have potential adversarial states that may be thinking about it, who may seek shelter from from peer adversaries.
Exactly.
So China and Russia, who have a much more relaxed view of proliferation, I think, because if you look at the last 25 years, 30 years since the end of the Cold War, if you're Russia or China, you see a US that gets really distracted by potential proliferators. Mm-hmm. And you say, if you're in Beijing and Moscow, maybe giving the US another thing to worry about isn't the worst thing in the world. And we might protect this state and just be a nuisance for the US. That's power politics. Maybe we should think about doing it to Russia and China too. I mean, the problem is that they're much more relaxed about proliferation. I mean, China basically decided a nuclear North Korea was preferable to a collapsed North Korea.
Yeah.
Right. And that was a strategic decision they made. And that's not to say that North Korea hasn't been a problematic or a headache for Beijing, but that's fundamentally the calculation that Beijing made. And so we may have there may be adversaries at a lower power plane who seek shelter and get shelter from Russia or China in the future. All the while, you have allies that are worried about our ability to provide extended deterrence indefinitely. And so you have these rise of hedgers. You may have somebody actively pursuing nuclear weapons being sheltered by China or Russia. And then in the middle, you have our frenemies, right? The frenemies who, are neither formal allies, not adversaries, but problematic friends, right? And what happens to them? It's sort of the states in the middle that have historically gotten out of the barn. India and Pakistan were outside of both the US and Soviet sort of Cold War balance of power, spheres of influence. Israel and South Africa were sort of, sitting outside also. And, is it possible that, UAE or Saudi Arabia is sort of in that same category? Possibly. And so you've got friends, frenemies, and foes all thinking about nuclear weapons. And they now have different ways to exploit either shelter or hedging. And I think we're in a new era of potential proliferation. We're going to have a lot of states that sort of turn on the ignition, but don't hit the gas pedal, if that makes sense, right? And so they think about it. They may put the car in neutral, stay in hedging. We may not know when they decide to go. They may try to present a fait accompli. They may stay there. So just getting eyes on these programs is going to be a huge challenge for the U.S. going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my follow-up question is, what should we be looking for? So in this new,
I don't know. Sometimes we may not know. I mean, how do you know, especially when it's a quiet decision? I mean, we can observe some stuff. If they slip up, you might find some facilities that you piece it together. Okay, this doesn't look all that benign. But knowing, we operate on the assumption that the red lights start flashing brighter as a state reaches the finish line. But South Africa, there were never any lights. Forget red lights, right? We caught them prior to a cold test and thought that the program had been shut down. And 4 years later, Pik Botha shows up at the White House and says, ha, 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 I've got nuclear weapons. And Reagan doesn't really know what to do with it. But Alex Haig, who's White House chief of staff at that point, sort of freaks out. He's like, we can't be talking about this in the Oval Office. Like, we can't have nothing to do with this. And, there's sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And not to sound like Donald Rumsfeld, but some of the signatures may be so covert and so clandestine, we may not know when a state has decided to go all the way. So I don't know what you look for. You need good human and great SIGINT. And we have a lot of that, but, and E-linked, but we may never know.
No, I think that's one of the increasing challenges. And especially if the US is distracted by other geopolitical issues, it's rather labor intensive to do that level of tracking, especially if there's so many countries that we need to be concerned about. I think, so in your book, you are a very honest academic and you go through your case studies and you think through, do they actually fit into my theory? You repeatedly test your theory. Do you see any of the current hedgers or hiders or potential hedgers and hiders as eventually going through a path that would break out of your proliferation strategy theory?
I definitely leave open the possibility. A lot of them, I think, and I'm being honest and think a lot of them fit closely, but I want to be careful not to use sort of the evidence of weaponization, a state's decision to weaponize as evidence of domestic political consensus. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I'll leave open is that you get enough sort of fringe elements in a state where even without domestic political consensus, you sort of get an active weaponization program. We haven't really seen it, but we also haven't seen the types and numbers of the types of regimes pursuing nuclear weapons that might be in the future, right? And what is domestic? Sorry?
What would be an example of that?
Well, so what is it? What does domestic political consensus in Saudi Arabia mean? I mean, can MBS just do it himself? If so, then it's not really consensus at that point. It's like, when does when does the sole leader decide? I mean, we're sort of operating with strong states with, sort of dictatorial or monarchical characteristics. So what does domestic political consensus mean? And how would you know it, right? If it's one person, it's not like there'd be any deliberation. One day he or she wakes up and that's it. Then what observable indicator would we have? And those are the kinds of cases that are hard, sort of where the theory doesn't have as much leverage, because you won't have the indicators, right, that you would want. I mean, with open debate in Sweden, you can see what happens. It's part of a deliberative process. With India, we could see, because there had to be budgets and there's parliament. And even though it was a sort of a closed system, there were enough indicators in a democracy to sort of infer that the Indians were weaponizing. And, I don't know if if that template will work going forward with the types of regimes and the numbers of those types of regimes going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a interesting point. I think the idea of different regimes is very interesting. In a lot of your case studies, it's a very bureaucratic process. And I wonder if you have any sort of thoughts about certain types of leadership. Thinking ahead, is there sort of, do you get concerned if you see a consolidation of power under a military dictator? Do you get concerned if you see a breakaway from a two-party system? Are there political flags that you can look for to get a better sense of how a country is thinking about proliferation?
I don't. That's a good question. I think you would still have to, whatever the configuration is and whatever it shifts to, you would still want to look for sort of that decision, that nuclear weapons and all it entails and the risks it entails are the solution to our security problem. And, I think it's easier in some types of regimes than in others to pick up those indicators. But, that part of the theory is, and I say this in the book, the most sort of under theorized and unsatisfactory. And political scientists have been trying to develop a theory for domestic political consensus for seven decades. And, I don't think I'm not going to do any better than they have. But that's, I think, an area that's really important for future research, to actually sort of unpack that variable, what it means across regime types, across time, like how much consensus is actually required. And for me, that was the most, unsatisfactory part of the theory.
I appreciate that answer. It's a very difficult one to sort of ascertain. I mean, every leader is different and every political structure is different.
Yeah, exactly.
It's always striking how much an individual leader can make so much of a change in a country's posture and a country's strategy. I do want to go back to, you had this great chart in your book about all of the different states who had tried to proliferate, who had successfully proliferated. Looking back at that research, what non-proliferation strategies did you see actually succeed? When you think back to the states who did not reach weaponization, who either stopped short or who walked back, what was it? What sort of prescriptive strategy can you say that has really succeeded in the past?
I think one, and this is sort of the theory behind the JCPOA, for example, is just fracturing domestic political consensus in a state where you might have that opportunity and keeping it fractured, right? So you can provide incentives to empower relative moderates in a government, those who may wish to, sort of forsake nuclear weapons for the sake of economic development, right? So there are ways to sort of keep a hedger hedging. You may not be able to push them completely out of the universe and scope out of the cases, but you can at least stop them from actively weaponizing. The other things that have been effective, is, and counterproliferation gets a bad name, and it's a dirty word after Iraq, but, you see efforts at sabotage that have slowed down programs. And, the Israeli strike on Syria really, set back whatever ambitions Assad may have had for nuclear weapons over a decade now, right? And so, sometimes if there's a ripe target, the U.S. initially, public reports suggest that the U.S. was hesitant in that case because, we were surging in Iraq and we had the Afghanistan war ongoing. The last thing the Bush administration wanted was escalation in the Middle East. And there was a real risk of escalation. So the Israelis gave the Syrians a face-saving way out and just didn't say anything. They hit it, they went back. Assad said they repelled the Israeli attack, and everyone sort of went on with their business because Assad was caught red-handed, and sort of, you take your hits when they come. And sometimes that's a very effective way to do it. So in general, there are efforts to sort of, if you can destroy the core of a program, sometimes you have to take the shot. In other cases, it's buying time. The most effective weapon is either sabotage, keeping domestic political consensus fractured so that a state doesn't actively weaponize and may not roll back, but at least you keep it stalled out. And buying time is often the best weapon that the nonproliferation community has, because in the intervening time, who knows what can happen internally, right? The cost of sort of just sitting there might be too much for the state. They may decide to give it up. There may be a regime change. There may be a new government. Who knows what will happen? And so strategies that help you buy time have turned out to be usually the most effective.
So this strikes me a previous conversation about what technologies can sort of impact the balance. I think information operations, disinformation, and media warfare, which we're seeing a lot more of out of China and out of Russia. I wonder if that doesn't also have its role in fracturing domestic politics.
Yeah. No, we didn't talk. Yeah. And we haven't talked about the novel information environment. I mean, I don't know how that cuts either. That's a good point. It's, there's a lot of open source intelligence now. The OSINT revolution, which includes sort of social media and this novel information environment, have really changed the way hunters hunt and the prey hide, and how much governments can keep secret. And on the other hand, a lot of, again, is separating, the wheat from the chaff. You get a lot of misinformation too. And so just separating out all of that puts us in a new information environment, which sort of complicates all of this. One view is it's just noise. It's all we've done is just injected more noise into the system, not more signal.
With no delay.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's a new environment, and I think we have yet to see. I think it can cut in multiple ways. I'm not sure it just points in one direction or the other.
Yeah, I think one thing I am looking forward to the next several years is seeing more literature on just how this new information age is impacting nuclear issues, because I think we're getting to a very interesting place where we've seen some great academic literature on how cyber is affecting these issues. Yeah. But I'm looking forward to seeing more done on the information side of things. Yeah, so we have about 9 minutes left. So I have a few quick questions. Again, about your book process and how you see things going forward. So I think this is a great addition to the field. If you were to look at the field, this book being out, what do you think are the next steps? What should we be looking at? What should we build upon from your book? What would you like people to read this book and then go and think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last questions you raised is really the natural one that comes out of this, which is, okay, you've got strategies of proliferation. What are your strategies of counterproliferation and nonproliferation? What do these suggest? And I hint at some of them, but that's another book. There's somebody out there to write that book. There's sort of, I think we want to get to the bottom of this, I believe, but we don't have great scholarship on this, whether, is extended deterrence one of the most powerful nonproliferation tools that we have, or, how will it impact other states' proliferation tendencies if, in a future political configuration, the U.S. commitment to its formal allies is sort of, put into greater doubt. And is it as big a proliferation risk as I think it is? And so I think there are a lot of great questions that come out of this. I mean, I think so long as there are nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons powers and states, we're going to need people to study them. And they're all sorts of questions. When I got into this business, a lot of the old Cold Warriors and that generation said everything that's needed to be said about nuclear weapons has already been said. And that's just not true. And, every day that goes by, we have new data points, new phenomena with nuclear weapons, and we need people to study them. And so, my plea to everybody is, don't let anyone tell you that nuclear weapons are passé or, they're boring. And there's always more to learn and study about sort of nuclear proliferation, nuclear strategy, nuclear non-proliferation, counter-proliferation, extended deterrence. There are a lot of areas ripe for research. And you think everything that's been said, that has to be said has been said, and it hasn't.
Yeah, I have to say that's one of the things that continues to pleasantly surprise me in this field is there's still so much to be looked at. And there's many, nuclear weapons themselves, but also the enterprises that run them are so incredibly complex. And there's so many sort of coupled interactions that we still don't know about. And I think it's always interesting to see the new scholarship that emerges for that. So we've looked forward. I want to do a quick look to the past and ask what books, what articles. You had a fantastic bibliography. Thank you for that. I always appreciate it when books do all the citations. But what were really the monumental works that you really leaned upon to write this book?
So I would say Sagan's 3 Models in Search of a Bomb, right, is sort of the landmark article on sort of all the sort of proliferation. That's what began the proliferation of proliferation scholarship. And so, you can't really start any work on nuclear proliferation without that, right? I think more recently, over the past decade, we've had sort of a rise in sort of the coercion literature. So Nick Miller, Stopping the Bomb, Montero and Debs, the strategic logic of nuclear, or the logic of nuclear proliferation, strategic logic of nuclear proliferation, forget the title of the book. But all of these were really important in bringing in sort of the deterring states that face high threats. So motivation for nuclear weapon may go up as your security threat increases, but your ability to potentially get them falls off if the threat is too great, because that threat can kill you. And so there's sort of a sweet spot that, state has to be in to sort of successfully hide or pursue nuclear weapons. And, there's a lot of great work on domestic politics. Malford Brout Heghammer's Unclear Physics, Jacques Hyman's Achieving Nuclear Ambitions. I just got Rachel Whitlark's new book on leaders in preventive war, and I'm assigning that in my graduate class. So there's a lot of great scholarship out there. There's a lot of new scholarship. There's a lot of old scholarship. But the proliferation literature, is the strategy literature is as old as the Cold War, 70 years old, right? Schelling was writing in the 50s and 60s. The proliferation literature actually isn't that big. And, we've had a lot sort of from an arms control community, excellent work, and not, a little, not as much from the academic community as you would think, but, that's just a call to do more. There's plenty more to do.
There really is. And then we'll finish off. We have a question from the Q&A, and that question is, do you see the potential for any particular emerging technology to provide convenient cover for hedging certain SMRs, for example?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, these are, so there's some are emerging technologies, some are new tactics too, right? So, there was states that want, so this isn't Australia with the AUKUS deal, because the way we design it can actually make sort of the deal somewhat proliferation resistant, because we can give sort of SSN technology that's good for the life of the boat, so the Australians never touch it. But let's say an ally like, I don't know, South Korea decides it wants SSN technology, and it wants, LEU fueled reactors for their boats. And then they say, well, we don't know if we'll have sufficient supply for the LEU reactors, so we have to enrich ourselves in order to ensure continuous supply for the LEU reactors. And that can be a gateway drug to sort of enrichment for HEU, right? And a weapons program. And so, that's one potential pathway. I think with reactors, there are the burning question for the civilian nuclear energy industry has always been, can you have civilian nuclear energy without proliferation risk? And it's possible, in the future, fusion technologies, we're seeing some fusion successes.
We've seen some really interesting things on the fusion front lately.
Sure. I mean, it's possible. I'm not sure it'll be in our lifetime, but okay, it's getting there. It is making progress. But for the most part, the core reality is no reactor is 100% proliferation proof, right? Technologically, which means you're really relying on political restraint by the sort of recipient or operators to not break seals, not do this, not do that, not reprocess this, and look what Taiwan did with the TRR. I mean, you think a reactor is proliferation resistant, everything is under safeguards, and all of a sudden you find a hole in the spent fuel pond and you don't know how much fuel is diverted. So I don't think there are technological solutions or panaceas. There are technological solutions, but I don't think they're technological panaceas to inherently a political problem.
I think that's a great answer. And of course, one that leads us to a little bit more research, like everything in this field.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Vipin. Thank you to everyone who has joined us this morning/afternoon. Vipin's book, Seeking the Bomb, is very, very insightful on these issues. I very much recommend it, as well as his past book. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Vipin, for joining me in this delightful conversation. We will be having a series of these conversations about nuclear proliferation in the 2020s. We will next be talking about the DPRK. So please look forward to that. Yeah, no, I think it'll be quite an interesting conversation. And then we'll talk about Iran and then do some more on emerging technologies in cyber and non-proliferation. So we hope to see everyone there. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Leah. I appreciate it a lot. Thanks everybody for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation. And everybody have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.